light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I wanted to offer some thoughts and reflections on what does God want? Initial perceptions of spiritual realities attribute to the divine, to higher spiritual beings, the forces that positively or negatively affect human experience. And so consequently, if there was a flood or something, people wanted to know what made God angry. Even for an atheistic sort of person, someone who might recognize some sort of mystery beyond themselves but doesn't want to assign a name or personification to that, there is still some sort of concern for the things that allegedly will encourage blessings and benefits and abundance and profit and so forth. I'm not interested in saying there's nothing to it, but at the same time, those who want to say there's everything to it seem to go too far as well. A lot of the world, a lot of the universe in which we live is composed, from our perspective, of mystery. That being noted, it still leaves us with the question or the perception, I suppose, if there is a mysterious, transcendent, infinite, eternal divine that is beyond human comprehension, is it possible to have a good relationship with that one might say is mutually beneficial, providing the divine with people to worship the divine, people to learn from the divine, people to let the divine know that there was something good about investing time and energy and love in us? I suppose there's nothing more disappointing than giving your energy, your attention, your efforts, your creativity, your management, if you will, to someone whom you hope will appreciate it, and how proud you feel when the guidance that you have provided brings blessings to their life and they respect it and they value it, and how disappointing when you show them the right way to go, you give them opportunities, you give them blessings, you give them resources, and they waste them. In essence, dishonoring the giver of those gifts. And that's obviously very human speculation on what things might look from God's perspective. From the divine perspective, obviously there's a whole lot more visible than any of us can really see. Even just the notion of being able to look at someone and see all of the things they've experienced, all of the things they've ever felt, and all the things that might someday happen to them depending upon the choices they make. To see all of that and have an understanding of that person that is most truly holistic, and with that holistic sort of perspective to still find the ability and the way and the desire to love that person. Perhaps that's grasping at a description of how human and divine are different. From our perspective, though, we keep coming back to, so what does God want? What is it that constitutes desirable activity and undesirable activity? What gives us the basis for right and wrong, for moral questions? In my study of morality, the conclusion I came back to was that human constructions of morality are generally tied to things in some way related to a perception of survival. That for someone to survive physically means doing the right thing, and something that is done that is adversarial to that would be considered wrong. It goes against survival. And So in a sense, all of humanity's rules and notions and principles about right and wrong are just an extension of how we perceive ourselves to be able to survive or not according to how we act in the present. That if we are wasteful, that's wrong because that means at some future time we may not have the resources to survive. And if being industrious and doing your work every day and getting, for a farmer, getting the seed planted and the harvest gathered in and so forth, well, industrious is good because, not because, but the parallel to that, we don't often think of it that way, but the parallel to that is that these are the things that allow us to survive. And so we just think of them as good without realizing that we're making that connection. But to me, that says that if we need to correspond or converse or negotiate with somebody from an entirely different cultural background, from another country, another way of looking at life, if we understand that they too are defining right and wrong according to things that allow them to survive, I think it creates more mutual respect so that we can begin jointly to look for things that allow both to survive, instead of saying it's one or the other. Accomplishing one's own survival at the expense of someone else who did not consent to that sacrifice strikes me as wrong, because it puts relationships in a framework of understanding in which the other person is an object, not a full person, to serve my survival. And from their perspective, I become just an object to serve their survival. I become a gathering of resources that if they can simply get me out of the way, they can take my resources. I am not a person in my own right. I am simply an obstacle to them possessing my resources. More ideally, I think, is when we have persons meeting with persons and joining in collaboration. The added layer of complexity to that, though, is that we each also have different perceptions and different conceptions of the divine, of what the divine wants, of what the divine is, how God wants us to live. One of the basic, every argument has some assumptions underneath it. Every language has certain basic assumptions in place. One of the basic assumptions that I think we need to note in addressing this in a calm, intelligent sort of way is the assumption, if you will, because I'm not trying to really prove it, that things are consistent within themselves, that if God really believes something as a fundamental dynamic, as I guess if you say the personality of God, if God believes in love, for example, it would follow that there are certain things God won't do because they're not loving and consequently not part of God's character. Theologians, of course, argue indefinitely about if God is so good, why do bad things happen? And God could intervene, but God doesn't, so does that mean God isn't good? And it's a very tangled sort of argument that probably will never be finished, because there isn't a clear answer to it as long as you look at it from only a human level of reasoning. Clearly, that which is God reasons in ways that people can't. I don't think that excuses all the bad things that happen, but it also suggests to me that they might not actually be God's fault. They may be somebody else's fault. Or they may not be the bad things we've made them out to be. There are things that hurt, and I'm not prepared to say that they're not bad. Sometimes maybe they are bad. In my own life, I guess it seems if I find a way to transform this negative event and draw something positive out of it, it's not that the bad thing suddenly becomes good. It's that it doesn't matter anymore. That it's in the past, what happened, but because I was able to draw good out of it, I find myself more able to let go and just let it be what it was. Even the descriptions of good and bad, and especially describing something as bad, is very, very subjective. It's very dependent upon a human perspective. It's not something that everybody would necessarily agree is bad, and from a scientific perspective, it seems that most things are not inherently good or bad. There's cause and effect. But the moral dimension is something that humanity brings to the situation. It's not something inherent in the situation. Is it bad for a deer to be killed by a mountain lion? Well, we say it's part of the natural order. I'm sure that if there is that kind of sentience, if there is that kind of understanding of relationship, that particular deer's family is going to be distraught that they didn't come home tonight. On the flip side, of course, the mountain lion's family is going to be thankful for having supper that night, because if the deer hadn't died, then they would starve. So there's all these back and forth sorts of things. Bringing this all back to our central topic of what does God want? I don't know that we can say for certain, but in bringing this subject up for discussion, it wasn't so much that I was hoping to define God within this episode. Yeah, like that's even possible in a half-hour show. Ridiculous notion. But what we do need to come to terms with is the competing ideas about what God wants. That one person will say, God doesn't want there to be any gay people on the planet. And another person will say that God made gay people because there's a unique function that gay people serve, a unique contribution they make that no other group or person could make. Something about their unique perspective that gives them a way of educating humanity in more empowering relationships. Noting that possibility, though, it doesn't recommend that we simply whitewash the category and say, well, then it's a good category. In and of itself, it's neither good nor bad, because within each category of people, we still have the choices and options and challenges of being a good example or a bad example of that particular classification. There are good and bad people within every classification you name. Good and bad gay people, good and bad lesbians, good and bad straight people, good and bad people of every ethnicity. The category doesn't make something good or bad. When we get into theological debates, however, there are certain categories at various points in time that particular groups' theology disallowed. For a very long time, for example, the Mormon Church had a theological argument against black people, labeling them the descendants of Cain. At one point in time, they changed their theology and created integration. That's only one of many, many, many different examples. There are churches that at one point in time subscribed to a negative view of all gay and lesbian people, and they don't anymore. Something about their theological understandings evolved. I don't think it's that God suddenly became something, or God confessed to having made a mistake, or that maybe that God was even involved in that discussion. It may have been completely a human discussion, and God was just waiting to see how we worked it out, rather than stepping in and slapping us all into line and saying, you do this and you do that and you do that, which would have turned us into objects, into robots, and we wouldn't be fully people anymore. I think it must be very, very difficult from God's perspective, though, to refrain from intervening because we're busy learning our lessons sometimes. In some ways, it might be like a wise and loving parent who knows the time to step back and allow their children to make mistakes. Because until, in some cases, until a child has somehow burned his hand on the stove, he will not believe the parent when the parent says, this is hot, you don't touch it because you will burn your hand. Some children listen and believe that. Some won't listen until they actually experience it for themselves. And so I'm sure there are countless numbers of parents out there who have attempted to instruct their children in certain ways, and still the particular child wants to go out and experiment for themselves, and they fall down and scrape their knees and get up and say, well, next time I guess I better listen. And sometimes they listen the next time, and sometimes they forget, or sometimes they don't think that what their parents said would happen really will happen, and then they find out that their parents were right. Or maybe in some cases they find out that their parents were wrong, that their parents were afraid of something that even the parents didn't fully understand. And from that place of not understanding, the child may learn something about how to keep it from having the effect the parents said it would have. But coming back to this point of what does God want? And a lot of people have tried to answer this in various ways, and any one of them or all of them might be right in their own particular context. I guess the thing that stands out to me is that there isn't one particular answer. That this is the one thing God wants from everyone, and that this is the only thing God wants from everyone. And now that we have one set of answers, I mean, it brings back the basic problem of dogmatism. For me, the essential definition of dogmatism is the notion or the claim that there is only one right answer, and it's the one I'm about to tell you, which basically says everybody who disagrees is wrong, and there's no freedom to disagree at all. The problem with not having the freedom to disagree is we never learn, because there's always more than one way of looking at and understanding things. In trying to determine what it is that God wants, one of the basic things that I hold on to is that God wants a whole lot of different things for a whole lot of different people. That because every corner, if we can agree that some notion of the divine was involved in the creation of the world in which we live, there is so much diversity in this world, so many different kinds of insects and plants and animals and anomalies that are still testing our knowledge and testing our ability to think broadly about things. I'm often reminded of the story of the discovery of the platypus in Australia, that initially no one would believe it was a real animal until they actually sent back a live one to England, and then they saw this animal that has combinations that exist nowhere else in the world. A mammal that lays eggs and all sorts of, like a duck-billed beaver or something. I mean, it was such a combination of different things that, well, I've heard other people joke that the platypus is what God made with all the leftover parts. However one wants to look at it, seriously or comedically, there is inescapable diversity. Consequently, it makes sense to me that because there is so much diversity, we all see things different ways. If God is more concerned with having a relationship of love with us than with it being the same relationship as God has with every other person, it would make perfect sense to me that the love of God would inspire, compel, whatever word you want to use, that God would manifest God's self in as many different ways as necessary so that a relationship with each person could happen at all. For a scientist, it might mean the divine manifesting as these breathtaking photos from the Hubble telescope of spaces and colors in outer space that have dimensions that are totally beyond our comprehension. They're so vast, millions of light years in measurement, and yet so beautiful. But of course, the other thing that we have to remember about that is the only reason we can see them at all is because of how far away we are. If we were standing too close, we wouldn't be able to see them at all. All of that, to me, comes back to my conclusion, I guess, that is perhaps peripheral, but perhaps related to this topic, that life is primarily about the growth of the soul. If what God wants most is for us to learn and grow and develop and to become more than who and what we are at any moment in time. There are millions of different ways to do that. There's no single recipe for what God wants. There's qualities, I think, that God would like us to embody. I don't know if that's even quite the right word, but if life is about the growth of the soul, and God is concerned that we grow, that we develop, that we learn, that we become more than what we initially find ourselves to be, then it's not so much about the specific forms, whether you wear this kind of shoes or that kind of clothing, whether you have a particular haircut, but it's about how we dress up our souls, whether we fill our souls with love and wisdom and kindness and compassion and gentleness and, having a passion, being inspired, not disgracing the giver of a gift by treating the gift that we receive disrespectfully. It's about the internal qualities. It's not about the trappings. It's not about the hair color and the clothing and the language. Things that, I think you would find it fairly universal, depending on how much the word translates, I suppose, but I think there's some understanding in every language. What we would describe as qualities that are godly or godliness. In every conception of the divine, it seems we ascribe to the divine, in most cases, the ideal way of being toward which humanity should reach, or the kind of dynamics that we should attempt to have, that as God expresses, or as we interpret that God expresses something akin to love toward us, in the same way we look for ways that we can embody and imitate that love toward each other, so that in a sense we become more like God, more like that which we put on the highest possible level of what could be, what could exist, the greatest kindness, the greatest love, the greatest wisdom. Regardless of what name we give it, if we're always moving toward that, we're always becoming more loving, more wiser, more understanding, more compassionate, more able to relate to a diversity of people and a diversity of perspectives, instead of insisting that this person who doesn't even look like me should actually live like me. That this person who doesn't even speak the same language as I do should somehow, in spite of that, have the exact same understandings that I do. Every language varies according to what the people experience and the words that they need to use for the life that they experience. In asking what does God want, the thing we have to keep coming back to remembering is that except for our own limited perception and understanding, our own ability to use language, we can't just ask God, what do you want? As a general answer, we can ask the divine in prayer, in meditation, in whatever form is helpful, what do you want for me? But the moment we start asking, what do you want for them, we put ourselves between them and God and begin to take on obnoxious tendencies to try to run other people's lives. And we simply don't have the wisdom to do that. That person has a history and a complexity and thoughts and emotions that we can only imagine. We don't know for certain. Therefore, we couldn't possibly identify ourselves as the one and only mouthpiece for God in that situation. If someone ever says, that they are the exclusive voice of God, that's the first person I would refuse to trust, because a human being cannot cram into their brain the infinite wisdom and infinite capacity for love that the divine by its very nature must have. In any case, I hope this has been a helpful show for you to consider. I hope I've shared some things that are helpful to your own growth, your own development of relationship with the divine. And when it comes down to it, if you want to know what the truth of God is, ask God and wait for the answer. And be very, very careful if somebody else wants to give you their answer, because their answer is their own and your answer is your own. Thank you very much for watching.